for the last several weeks, we have observed Jesus making his way toward Jerusalem. And it is a journey that began in a little bitty town called Caesarea Philippi. You see our graphics up there. It talks about the things that we are doing. So there's a little map of Caesarea Philippi. Do you have it up there, Ryan? There it is. See the arrow? Yes. The arrow is Caesarea Philippi. Do you see the yellow line? Yes. It points towards Jerusalem. Everything started here in Caesarea Philippi. Before then, Jesus was kind of running around and doing various types of ministries and various types of people, both Gentiles and Jews and Samaritans, all alike. And so now he gathers these folks, these disciples, in this little town in Caesarea Philippi, and this is where it all starts. His journey is descent down to Jerusalem. And I think it's Luke, if I remember correctly, has a word that describes what Jesus did. This is the place where he set his face to go towards Jerusalem. Now, I say that a million times, and I just love that statement because I think it's the most overlooked phrase that we can possibly have in our faith. Jesus had to intentionally set his face to go towards Jerusalem. I want us to understand and see that and visualize what that looks like, but also the necessity for Jesus to do that, and also the necessity for us in our faith to do that as well. And the reason for that is this: because Jesus understood, not because he was God, but because he was a human and had a brain and had reason, that by going to Jerusalem this time, as everything was heated up, that there were some bad things that were going to take place. The writing was all over the wall. And so he knew that there was going to be a lot of pain that was awaiting him in Jerusalem. He knew there'd be a tremendous amount of harassment. He knew there'd be a lot of public humiliation that awaited him there. He knew that there's a possibility and a probability that there would be beatings and floggings and misery that just waited him there, because that is how the people were. But he also knew that he would be alone. His followers were not mature enough to handle the situation that they were about to get into. So he was going to be alone. He was going to be walking into a snake pit, and he was going to do it all alone. And if he relied on his feelings throughout this entire journey, he would have never even gotten close to the city of Jerusalem. And there's not one person that would have blamed him. But Jesus did not. He did not allow his fears, he didn't allow his feelings to determine his life. He allowed God to help him make up his mind, to determine his purpose, to shape his heart. So when his mind was clear and his heart was full, that his course was determined, that he had to set his face, knowing the dangers that he was going to go through. Determination. That no matter how I feel along the way, I am not going to desert the path that God has given me. Now, not only does Jesus expect his disciples or us to set our face around God's purpose for our life, but he also tells us that if we allow his Spirit to live in us, then we together can do far more than Jesus was ever capable of doing. So in Jerusalem, Jesus was flogged. While in Jerusalem, he was beaten to a pulp. He was too battered. He was too weak to even carry his own cross to his own death. So they grabbed a man out of the crowd by the name of Simon, and they strapped Jesus' cross on his back, and there they went to a place they called the Skull. Nice place to live or to go. Jesus' only support came from a few faithful women who cried hysterically at the sight of Jesus and this unbelievable treatment that was given to him. But Jesus was not to be crucified alone. There were two criminals who would die with him. So let me pick up this part of the story. Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with Jesus. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right, one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by, watching. The leaders scoffed him. "Well, he saved others. Let him save himself if he's the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. And coming up, they offered him sour wine and saying, "If you're the King of Jews, save yourself." There was an inscription over him, "This is the King of Jews." One of the criminals who was hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "If you're the Messiah, save yourself and us." But the other one rebuked him. "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? We indeed have been condemned justly. We're getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you'll be with me in paradise." There are a couple of things about this scripture that just kind of stick out to me more than anything. And this first one that I want to pull out is just kind of slapped me upside the head yesterday or the day before, and I thought it was worth noting. But to understand this first point I want to make about this text, we got to go back a little bit to the original text that set up this whole sermon series on are we able to drink the cup as Jesus. There's a story that we took that out of Matthew's gospel, where Jesus is telling his disciples for the third time about all the events that's going to take place in Jerusalem, about his suffering, his arrest, his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. And so, hearing it three times starts to set in, right? So thinking, all right, so something really is going to happen here when we go down there. And so that kind of causes a little bit of panic to take place in a couple of brothers, but not only them, but their mother as well. The third part in the story just kind of shows up, as moms tend to do at the most inopportune times. But there they are, and Jesus is pulled aside by James and John and their mother, and she has this strange request. She says to them, "Declare that these two sons of mine will sit, one at your right hand and one on your left hand in your kingdom." I would love to see Jesus' face when he said, "You don't know what you're asking." And they didn't. They had no clue. Because in their minds, I'm sure to be sitting on the left and the right hand of God was a pretty cool place to be, wouldn't you think? Right? That's kind of a cool status to have, I'm thinking. Right? To sit on the left and sit on the right is kind of an honor, a place of honor, a place of respect, a place of power, of popularity, safety, right? Recognition. You'd probably have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops to be able to sit on God's right and God's left-hand side. Probably when, Bible trivia. I'm thinking that's probably a big thing you got to do. Probably got to be a flamboyant leader, great speaker, televangelist, maybe could raise millions of dollars by a single sermon or have millions of viewers. That'd be probably pretty good. Maybe log in a whole bunch of volunteer hours, maybe more than the next person. And be Jesus' favorite, the Messiah's pet. That always goes a good way. The ones who gets Jesus coffee and his newspaper and pipe and slippers. So I'm thinking that would probably get you on the left and the right-hand side of God's, but maybe not so fast. So I want us to fast forward a little bit to today's reading, when Jesus is being crucified. When the criminals were led away to die with Jesus, it says this: when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. I'm thinking none of those guys won Bible trivia. Does that make sense to you? I can hear James and John saying now, hey man, that ain't fair. That ain't fair. Because James and John, they did not know what was being asked of them. Because they could not and did not understand the depths of God's love that they were about to experience. But now one of the criminals was a smart aleck, but the other criminal had this realization as to who Jesus was at that moment. And it was Jesus who then welcomed him to paradise. By the way, paradise is a word that's only used to describe the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were kicked out. And so here Jesus welcomes him into this garden, this paradise. And this man was able to see what the disciples who had been with Jesus for 3 years were still too blind to see. Because the question was for Jesus, could James and John really submit their life to God's purpose? Could they actually deny their impulses for self-gain? Could they actually be a servant that God expected them to be? Could they remain humble and give themselves unselfishly to others? Were they willing to die a criminal's death for the sake of those who are persecuting you? They said yes. But Jesus said, no, not yet. But you will. But not yet. However, the moment that we fail or fall down on our knees, in the moment that we humbly cry that we have failed to drink from the same cup of Jesus, is the very moment that God will lift us up and build us into the person until we possibly can. This is a story of those who have failed. In the world in which we live, we discard those who are failures and those who are losers, but God has a tendency to recycle us and turn us into valuable instruments for God's purpose. Don't ask me why God does that or how God does that. Just be thankful that we're one of God's recycled losers. The second point I want us to think about this scripture is also the final ingredient to this cup that Jesus drinks from. It was emphasized up on the cross, the hours of the cross that led to the hours of his suffering and his death. When Jesus looked down on the mockers and those who were yelling at him and screaming at him and all of his haters, he looked down upon them and he said these words, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing." Most powerful words, I think, that we could possibly read in Scripture, given the circumstances. Now, I think it's safe to say that we would rather be the recipients of forgiveness than be the ones who have to let go of our anger, the ones that release our grudges, our pride, and to forgive someone who we think may or may not deserve or earn our forgiveness. But what we have seen time and time again, and brought up time and time again, that God's kingdom is a far cry from this world's values. God's values are not this world's values. And as long as we have this Christ Spirit living within us, not only is forgiveness something that we are mandated to do, but is also the most powerful and the most possible thing that gives life not only to individuals but also to communities, regardless of whatever circumstances that we find ourselves in, that forgiveness is possible for every single person. I want to show a picture of two ladies. These two ladies, if you look at it pretty closely, they're the matriarchs of this village that we work with in Ecuador. Presir Grande is the name of this village. These two ladies are the movers and the shakers of this community, about 900 people, right? Nothing gets done without these two folks. Men are men, right? But women are the heart of third world countries, if you don't know that. Everywhere you go, it's always the women who are the movers and the shakers. These two women are the movers and the shakers of this community. The one on the far, and kind of the pink, far away from us, her name is Overlisa, and I call her my mamacita. She is the one that she's kind of a mom to me that I always go to, the first person I always go to. We've eaten at her house, stayed at her house, and all sorts of different things. The one that's closest to us, the very tall lady, she's a little over 6 foot tall, her name is Sonia. And she is a pretty special lady as well. But if you look pretty close at these pictures, I don't know if you can see it very well, they don't look like happy campers, do they? They hate each other. They have been so mad at each other. And we couldn't figure out why. We kept asking. This finally we just realized that, well, their battle's been going on for over 20 years. Petty, real petty, as most arguments are, right? See, their kids grew up together. They went through confirmation class together. They're going to take their first communion together in their village. And all of a sudden, the priest got sick. And so Overlisa, who's kind of the bigger matriarch, decides, hey, the group, we're going to wait till the priest gets better. And then when he comes back, we'll take our first communion together. That could be months out there. It could be even a year or two. Well, Sonia says, nope, I'm not going to do that. So she went to the town, another village, and her and her child had their first communion. And that was enough. That was enough to put a wedge between them. And as we know, even the most petty issues that we can come up with over periods of time continue to grow calluses and hardness and hatred that is just thick. And there's nothing you can do about it. When I was there last month, or a couple months ago, or in January, I guess it was given the task to be able to preach on Sunday. And so they were there in the audience, so I kind of made reference, a whole sermon centered around forgiveness, reconciliation, because if we don't have that as a community, the things that we need to accomplish as a people of God is impossible to accomplish. And so we tried to gather this and garner this and talk through this. And right when I was finished the sermon, the lady in the middle is named Blanca. She works with us when we go to Ecuador. She took it upon herself to grab those two ladies, bring them up before the church, and force them to hold hands, just like you would little kids, right? And just kind of talk about their situation and made them promise that they were going to reconcile, that they were going to forgive each other so that we as a community can move forward. And over time, that would take place. Well, I went there last month, just got back about a week ago. And you're probably wondering, well, did it work? And I will say right in front of you, it did not. Right? We talked over Lisa about it. She goes, do not ask me to do that. Over what? Something very petty. But it prevents a whole community from coming together. A whole community from realizing their potential as a people. You know, folks, this isn't just happening in Presir. It happens every day of our life. I bet you can look right now at your life and go, yeah, that's happened to me. It's happening to me. I'm doing it or someone's doing it to me. I guarantee every last one of us could do that. Because we have allowed our minds to convince ourselves that reconciliation and forgiveness are just an impossible task in some circumstances. But in the mind that is influenced by Christ, understands that forgiveness is the most powerful message. in the greatest act of love and grace that not only transforms our lives, the lives of others, but lives of communities. Have you ever heard of the resurrection before? Maybe you read that story? It's a pretty cool story. Maybe we'll read it next week. But the act of forgiveness has become stronger, and it has to become stronger than any type of feeling or grudge or bitterness or anger that we harbor. And it's just amazing to me that if Jesus could look down at all those who have persecuted him, who spit upon him, throw rocks at him, as one who was suffering from one of the most brutal acts of all human history, and then he has the audacity to ask God to forgive us, then who in the world are we as his followers to withhold that grace and refuse to reconcile because we have feelings of anger or bitterness? Who are we? The old saying is, to err is human. To forgive is what? Divine. Make no mistake about it. The divine lives within you. Can you drink from that cup?